Hi, welcome to today's video. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about how to blend with acrylics. Now, with blending, you first need to determine whether you are working with a wet on wet situation or a wet on dry situation. And this just means you're using a layer of wet paint, adding it onto a layer of another wet paint, and blending the two together. That's wet on wet. Wet on dry means that there's already a base layer of paint that has already dried completely, and you're just adding paint on top of that and going with it from there. In both scenarios, there's different techniques you can use to blend the paint. Today's tutorial will only cover a wet on dry situation. So our base layer has already dried. We're adding wet paint on top of that. How do we blend it? Let's get started.
Okay, the technique we're going to be using is called dry brushing. And so what that entails is you have one brush to apply your wet paint. And then you have a completely separate brush, which is dry. And you're going to use that to blend out the edges. Now, after you've done a blending job with your dry brush, you're going to want to wash it out and let it dry so that you can continue to use it. Now for your dry brush, I like to use a rounder head, not sharp or square like this one. I get better results with a rounder head, and you can see that this brush has been used. It's a little bit looser, so I'm going to start off using this, and then later on in the video I'll use a smaller one like this for my dry brush.
Okay, the technique behind dry brushing is very straightforward. It'll take some practice to get good at it, but the idea behind it is easy. I have my two brushes, one for applying the paint and my dry brush for blending it. Say I have something and I want to blend it out. Say I want to blend this object from left to right. Take my dry brush, make sure it's dry, and start scrubbing out the color from the left to the right like this. Just like that. That's the entire technique we're going to use for dry brushing. So you can see that this technique is not actually blending two colors together, but it's thinning out the top color to give the illusion of blending into the bottom color. Let's try a practical example.
Okay, so here we have a cherry, and this background color has already dried. So let's use the dry brush technique to make this cherry look more 3D. Okay, I'm going to start by adding this red here as a mid-tone, and I'm going to let that completely dry before adding my next layer. So if you're finding that your paint is drying too quickly so that you can't scrub out the edges proficiently enough, you might want to think about adding some water to your paint or a medium to keep it from drying as quickly, or work in smaller sections and just use more layers. Okay, that first layer of red midtones has completely dried, and here I'm adding a second layer. Okay, now that that layer has completely dried, I'm going to start on some highlights. Now, a reminder, this is not a video on how to paint a cherry, so I'm not too worried about where these highlights go or the shading or all that. It's simply to give some examples of how to use this dry brushing technique. Now, using the same methods, I'm just going to add some reflected light on both sides of the cherry. Okay, here's our finished product.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a few final thoughts. Dry brushing is one of the most important tools for your toolbox when working with acrylics. It will take a lot of practice to get proficient at, because every paint brand out there from brand to brand are very different in their thickness, in their drying times. It's going to take time for you to learn how to properly manipulate the paints and the brands that you personally use. The paints that I used and the canvas and the brushes are very, very low tier, intentionally to show you that you don't need the most expensive products to be able to get a very desirable outcome. So you just need technique and a lot of practice. Okay, for any questions or comments, leave them down below, and I encourage you to subscribe for more videos. Thanks for watching.